Hey ARKS Silhouette here. The second closed beta test for PSO2 New Genesis has ended, and as you know, I had the pleasure of taking part in it and live streaming my experience with it over the weekend, as well as spending some time with the game offline as well to appreciate some of the technical details. Now, this naturally leads to the question, Silly, what did you think of New Genesis? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing today, so buckle up for some hot takes and get some popcorn ready, because we're going for a ride. First things first, a bit of a disclaimer, and it's not to insult anyone's intelligence, it just bears mentioning. The B in CBT stands for beta, and as such, most of this should probably be taken with a grain of salt or sugar or whatever condiment you prefer. While I do think there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from the closed beta test regarding the direction New Genesis is going in and the state of the game's development, among other things, this could all be turned completely on its head in the future. Sega and the Phantasy Star team could quite literally be holding an entire other game up their sleeve during this here poker game, for better or worse, so just try to remember that. Also, there are quite a few things that can reasonably be excused due to the nature of it being a beta test, so while I will mention some things that otherwise probably won't be an issue in the final game, please be assured that I note their transient nature. Also, please be aware that I will be fairly critical about this. I know a lot of other PSO2 content creators are rather sensitive about their relationship with Sega and maintaining hype with their fans, but I'm more interested in giving this a real take, so try to adjust your expectations accordingly. That said, if you do disagree or if you have a comment or something, absolutely drop it in the comments below and I would love to talk to you about it. That said, no further delays. Getting right into it, the game looks fantastic. With all the hype surrounding the new character models and brilliant open environment that we've been experiencing, it is easy to get a little jaded, but truth be told, it really has nailed the graphical presentation. Initially, I was personally not altogether that interested in the new character models, and even kind of felt like they were a bit too porcelain, maybe? Almost like an early 90s 3D animation series. Color me surprised. When you're out and about with them in New Genesis, they really blend well and they don't ever leave you with that sensation, while also giving you a lot of freedom in how your character looks, so hey, that's awesome. The environment and world space is where New Genesis truly shines, and that is apparent even in the closed beta test. While not all areas are equal, I mean obviously some of the cocoons are a little more flat, but it is easy to see that Sega and the Phantasy Star team really put their A-game into creating this very wonderful looking world space to let their players loose in. We only got to see the beginning of the area region, and even this relatively small region included drastically different regions and dazzling sights in it, such as the humbling rolling plains of Central Aero, the swamps and mountain regions to the north, Mount Magnus combat region to the northeast, and the gorgeous southern area, which happens to be my favorite area in the closed beta test. The Phantasy Star series has often displayed an adeptness in environmental design. As a person who started the series with Phantasy Star Universe, I always loved the almost diorama-like appearance of the environments between mission areas, and you can see the same love and personal touch has been put into a lot of New Genesis environments on the macro level. The combat is smooth and responsive, and it feels really good. I mostly played Fighter and Force, two classes I felt like represented very different playstyles and speeds, and both of them played really nicely. One of the big concerns I think a lot of people had going into New Genesis, I was definitely one of them, was the removal of just attacks and the lack of complexity that this would infer. But in reality, it really isn't all that big of a deal. Combat still feels fairly good to engage in, and there are plenty of opportunities to shake up the game, such as countering enemies with either weapon actions or step counters, depending on what you have available. Fighter is obviously the in-your-face speedy boy that you expect him to be, and I love it, while Force naturally seems to lend itself to quite a lot of cheese, given its floating nature. Combat is a lot more dramatic and interesting given the great differences in the environment as well, because it feels like there's a lot more verticality to the game this time around, especially with your ground pound move where you can travel down very fast and do damage. And when you have the opportunity to experiment with these kind of things, it's just wonderful. The extension of the dodge function into Photon Sprint is a great addition that encourages maneuverability in combat and using it at all times to keep on top of or away from the enemy you're fighting. And it frankly is just wonderful because you can very easily use it. Like, it's intuitive. You dodge twice, there you go, you're running, you're a fast boy, there you go. It's wonderful, I love it. Debuffs applied to enemies often are accompanied with unique animations and results in pretty significant downtime for the enemy, which makes them feel very worthwhile, even though they do seem to happen much more rarely than in PSO2 Classic. While platforming is something the game makes use of in general, cocoons are where it really shines, often sending players hopping between various floating tiles and kicking off of walls in an effort to get every single floating golden object that we need and want, and shortening time as much as possible. The cocoons that we visited showed a variety of objectives, with some regarding time trials, platforming, combat, and even a combination of all of them at some point or another, which promises to enhance gameplay quite a bit. One of my favorite experience was the cocoons was a particular one we found in the infamous The Wall cocoon, where we discovered that one of the upper paths actually required kicking up on a nearby wall to reach a disconnected platform. This really lends itself into some of the great platforming, and I think we can expect a lot of this in the future, and it's great. Once the game releases, I'm hoping we see a ton more of this kind of stuff. On to more technical aspects of the game. While it was rather difficult to make full use of it in casual play given the language barrier, the new augmenting system promises a lot less nightmares in the long run for players, as the possibility of losing augments after applying them is a thing of the past. And the capsule-only system is fairly simple and easy to use. It's really an interesting direction to go in. I don't think it's going to be worse. I think it'll be simpler and better. I don't think augmenting was ever supposed to be the crazy beast that it is in PSO2, and it kind of grew out of control. I think this might actually be a better look for it, to be honest. There's a lot of other little things that I think could really be said in favor of the game, but I think those are the big takeaways, and we probably ought to also get to some of the more negative aspects, in my opinion, which I think are very important, and also save a little bit of time. There are some notable issues we encountered while playing the closed beta test, and some concerns that came up during our time with it. A lot of these can be discarded out of hand with, it's a beta, largely because a lot of these specific issues are easily changeable and don't require great adjustments to the intended functionality of PSO2 New Genesis. One of these is that mobs are generally one of two extremes, either extremely easy or extremely chunky, even with relatively generic mobs and 32 players of decent level beating on them. A great example of this is exactly that. We encountered a Nagarus in the Urgent Quest 1 or 2 levels higher than us, and over time, 32 players slowly trickled in and were fighting it for nearly half an hour or more, dealing almost no damage. Nagarus isn't a particularly rare monster. I felt like I ran into him a lot in the CBT, so it's a good example of a fairly common monster just kind of taking forever. But this is also a good example of an issue that can be changed very easily. You're just tweaking some numbers, it's not a big deal. Let's discard it, it's not worthwhile criticism. Similarly, things like gathering being a bit slow or issues with syncing up with party members in the same instance in a region, even though those happened, or even getting into parties to begin with, all are relatively easily fixed bugs and can be discarded. We can expect those to be fixed on launch, no problem. Despite this, there are some notable concerns. New Genesis appears to be heavily leaning into the genre of slower-paced, open-world adventure games, and this is evident when you play through it. A lot of your time is spent moving through the world, oftentimes exploring new areas, and it definitely distances itself from the fast-paced, go-here-from-there gameplay of PSO2 Classic. The issue I personally see looming on the horizon is that New Genesis is largely sticking to populating the game with tried-and-true, fast-paced, arcade-style content within this medium, such as emergency trials that amount to fighting off waves of enemies or just attacking targets, and a collection of random enemies here and there. And it really feels like it is stretching itself between two very different types of games, and it is not playing to either one's strengths. At this time, I feel like this is the biggest and most pressing obstacle facing the game. What I think is possibly the greatest example is that the world just feels very empty at times. And not just on the level of there not being crowds of players wandering around in each instance area, but also in the sense that there is almost nothing noteworthy to keep you looking. Red crates are hidden here and there, and sometimes you can find a cave rich in gathering spots, but at the same time, most of these don't give you a reason to hang around for too long or to return too often, unless you just happen to feel like it. Now, for what it's worth, this wouldn't be altogether that bad if it wasn't for the fact that New Genesis almost implicitly encourages you to explore the world and see the sights for yourself as practically a core gameplay mechanic. And this core gameplay mechanic that I'm saying is the aside from fulfilling client orders, which so far are largely just the usual fare of killing off mobs and achieving gathering or other objectives. New Genesis tries to break up this monotony of roaming aimlessly from place to place with emergency trials. But this just kind of feels like it isn't sufficient on its own. We can disregard the lack of variety in emergency trials in the closed beta tests because I'm sure they're going to fix that. And they basically amounted to attacking targets or defending a concession stand every now and then. I'm sure Sega and the Phantasy Star team, they're going to broaden that amount and the variation of these trials when game releases. We don't have to worry about that. But they would have to make so many different trials for these to be the only items in the game that keep you moving and playing the game in this open world. The biggest issue here, the world is practically lifeless. You find campsites here and there, but there's no one there. There's not a whole lot of environmental storytelling going on. There's nothing happening there. Occasionally there's a crate you can break. The open world genre is known for this kind of stuff. Storytelling, amazing points of interest, puzzles, all that good stuff. It doesn't have any of it. For all its splendor, once the novelty of the world space wears off, it falls into the background of the experience as the game becomes a routine of going from point A to point B. And while I'm sure there are people out there who will be more than happy to admire the same areas over and over, I don't think the majority of players will ultimately be satisfied with that. And I would be remiss to not try and suggest how you can fix it. I think they can. One of the ways I think Sega and the Phantasy Star team could tackle this issue, if they chose to, is to set aside a team for the purpose of populating these regions, dedicate them to this. Modern game developers who work in these genres already do this. Adding puzzles, points of interest, things you can interact with, discover, and even just observe as they happen are things that are present in other video games. Think back to other open world adventure games, like say, I don't know, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which has since become the poster child of this kind of genre, or even something relatively related to our niche fandom, such as Genshin Impact, or even going as far back as the king of ports all the way from 2011, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. All of those games tackle this issue, to varying degrees of course, but by populating the world with hundreds upon thousands of distractions that make your exploration more worthwhile and culminate into more than just a pretty photograph and a, "That's neat." Part of the reason they're so successful is because they engage you in your exploration, and oftentimes in the world itself. Halpha is supposed to be this new planet that ARKS has just found and is setting up upon, but despite that, there's no population besides monsters outside of the hub city. You know, something as simple as a patrol of ARKS operatives in gathering zones, or even the far-off sight of a cargo ship flying from one region to another, could add so much more to the dynamic of this part of the game. Little points of interaction would be great. Data pads are great for passing out lore, but what if we kind of changed it up a bit? Replaced a data pad with a, I don't know, I'm thinking off the top of my head here, how about the remains of a monster nest, where when your character inspects it, you learn more about the creatures in that area from a first-person narrative in your character's thoughts. Hey, there you go. Have at it, Sega. Another good idea to add would be something like puzzles. I mean, puzzles allow your players to interact with the world for rewards, or hey, even just to access new areas. What if there was like a little valley and it had a big, huge obstruction in the middle and you had to figure out how to like open it up somehow? Maybe there's gears that control a gate. Maybe you gotta knock some rubble away to get away a rock slide or something. Something interesting like that. Things to keep you engaged with the world, and I think puzzles do a really good job of that. In fairness to the beta, it did feature at least something like that, with some red crates that had drones that protected them. But this kind of feels like it's more of like a copy and paste quest than anything else. It really didn't seem like it was being applied anywhere else, so I'm not sure if it's something that they're going to try and use elsewhere. I think lastly, the one big thing that I think this game is missing in terms of, what it's doing with its world space is there's almost no environmental storytelling. And it can go a long way if you use it right. For example, instead of the perfectly intact but unpopulated campsite, which you do find here and there, especially in like southern area, how about a ruined campsite that appears to have undergone quite a struggle, quite a bunch of attacks by wild, ferocious animals, claw marks here and there, stuff knocked over, it's terrible, it's awful, it's messy. Maybe you find a datapad in the camp somewhere that indicates, hey, a nearby gang of fangolfers keep attacking this campsite. Don't worry, security's got them. Ha 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 ha, it's no big deal. But obviously, it's a much bigger deal. Something else must have happened, right? After all, these claw marks, they look like they're from something much bigger, much huger than just a couple of fangolfers, which are about the size of a small wolf. There's a perfect opportunity for this kind of thing in southern area. There's a researcher's camp that is perilously close to a cove where not only a large number of fangolfers are stationed to spawn there, but is also home to their boss, a very powerful Ard Banshee that spawns there all the time. Things like this give life to a world. It gives you more incentive to explore, and it allows it to live. It gives it a life of its own. In the closed beta test, a lot of the times you're just simply running from place to place at a very relatively slow pace, and you find yourself just randomly attacking creatures to stave off that boredom. Sometimes it's because the world lacks this stuff. That's probably the really biggest issue the game is facing. I personally see it as like I mentioned before, the biggest obstacle that New Genesis has right now, at least based on the closed beta. Another issue that's nowhere near as large in severity, and is more of a personal thing in my opinion that I don't think is a very good idea, would be that I think that My Shop is a distinct step down in terms of player trading experience than even that of PSO2 Classic, and that's a really hard blow for me personally. I know that Phantasy Star Team unfortunately doesn't have a whole lot of wiggle room here, given that personal quarters aren't in the game and there's really no other analog for this, but frankly, I already felt that PSO2 Classic's terminal-based shopping system was a bit lackluster, especially when compared to, say, some of the previous entries in the series like Phantasy Star Universe, where your shop was part of your room and players came to it in order to shop from you. The reason PSU's system was preferable is because it helped to create more player-to-player engagement in the economy. It gave players incentives to decorate their rooms and show off and give thoughtful placement to things, as well as just made the experience all that more dynamic. If you were chilling out in your room, people would pop in and you would talk with them, and it was very cool that way. Now, in PSO2 Classic, we traded that for a more anonymous, terminal-based system that, while less engaging and fun in my opinion, at the very least allowed for a certain amount of convenience, since there was a terminal every few feet in the main hub. In PSO2 New Genesis, to my knowledge, and in my experience so far, this has been reduced even further. It only happens at the My Shop kiosk in the hub city. I feel like this is going in the wrong direction personally, but to be honest, I recognize this is mostly a matter of taste. I guess it just seems like not only a great but missed opportunity to improve the player market experience in PSO2, but also a step in the wrong direction personally, negating this type of market's key benefit, which is accessibility. I know it may not seem like accessibility is that big of a difference here because it's in the hub city just like the other ones were in the hub world, in the ARK ship, but with the time you're expected to spend outside of the hub city, it just seems like it's not nearly as at your fingertips anymore. I have some other minor concerns. They're very unimportant, I personally feel like. Mostly just things like swimming is neat, but unsubstantive as an addition to the game. Like, it doesn't do anything. You swim, it's actually better to jump out of the water and glide. Otherwise, swimming doesn't do anything. All that stuff I don't really feel like was worth going through the rigmarole with this, lest the video come off as unnecessarily hostile to New Genesis. But I really feel like the world space is one of the biggest things that needs to be worked on to make New Genesis a success. I think the My Shop thing is a letdown, and I specifically noted it because player markets just seem like such a big feature of not only Phantasy Star, but MMOs in general, for it to have been neglected like this. And before anyone says, well, it's a beta test, so it's still in development, they're probably working on these things already, or something to that effect, the reason I bring up these criticisms now and consider them in the light that I do is specifically because beta testing tends to be closer to the end of development cycles than in the middle or the beginning of them. And most of the planning and decision making for fundamental features tends to be, well, all the way at the beginning. Meaning that while there certainly is the potential that Sega and the Phantasy Star team have been holding back a very different game from us in the closed beta tests and are ready to spring it as soon as the game releases, which has been hinted to be potentially as early as April 2021 in the past, the more likely scenario is that these items were never intended to make it into the release, whether that be because they weren't brought up, or because they were but were rejected, or because the resources had to be dedicated to other portions of the game and therefore these were either delayed or scrapped. While I would hesitate to say that these things are the most important parts of the game, they're still pretty big things that should have been accounted for much earlier in development and would have some form of presence in the closed beta test because of how fundamental this is to the experience. I've shopped some of these thoughts around a bit as well, and one of the things that keeps coming up is that, well, PSO2 is a live service, and they'll probably release pretty bare bones and continue developing New Genesis while relying on PSO2 Classic to hold players' attentions. Which I don't personally think is a good way of doing things, but hey, maybe so. I do think there is a problem with that, though, if that is the case. Open development is usually much slower than closed development in terms of video games and their production cycles. Now, granted, live service MMOs are kind of a special case, but it generally remains true. Closed development has more staff brought in to get the product in the door, and once it's live, teams generally scale down as they pair off into maintaining existing content, producing new content, and then being split off into other projects entirely. This means that, if this is the case, we can expect improvement over a much larger timescale than I think people actually realize. Furthermore, if they do try to go that route and they do try to avoid that problem, they'll be dedicating more resources to PSO2 Classic to try and create more content to hold us over, which further delays the improvements to New Genesis because it takes resources from New Genesis development and dedicates them to PSO2 Classic. It's one or the other, unfortunately. They're competing with each other in terms of players, and New Genesis needs to have a strong start. At the end of the day, the closed beta test 2 feels like it solidly represented the systems in place that formed the foundations of the core gameplay experience. There's little things that I absolutely expect to be completely improved upon by the time of release, like enemy and emergency trial variety, quality of life changes such as HP and damage from enemies, spawn rates, etc. And there's some very notable and some minor things that I feel like detract from the overall experience. If I had to put it into a strict numerical scale, at this time, I feel like New Genesis is somewhere around a 6 out of 10 experience, give or take half a percentage in either direction. I personally feel like New Genesis needs another year or two in development to really get it right, and would really benefit from a dedicated team working on playing to the world space's strengths and giving it more depth to match its initially impressive appearance. For the positives, I hope they keep trucking. For the negatives, I'm very eager for Sega and Phantasy Star team to prove me wrong and deliver the amazing game that I can absolutely see lying underneath these blemishes. New Genesis truly does have the potential to be great, and I sincerely hope that that potential is realized. Well, that's all of it, guys. Everything in this video is just my thoughts and opinion. I'd love to hear from you about what you think, and if you've had time to watch the footage of New Genesis, closed beta test, or even play it for that matter, comment down below, and I'd love to discuss it with you guys. Remember to drop a like and subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my content going forward. I'm really trying to do my best to do what I can and get information and hot takes out there that aren't burdened by like faux hype and interest in living off of YouTube. You can also support my channel by purchasing a fancy Shifta and Debam mug I made. They're pretty cool. They're in Teespring. Link in the description down below. Also, I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning, as well as every second Saturday night over at twitch.tv/sillygames. I'd be happy to see you there. But yeah, this is Silhouette, and I'm signing off. ARKS Ops, may you have all the rare drops.